It was at this point that I was starting to freak out a little. Like, this is literally the first thing I'm trying to implement and I'm getting hard stuck. How in the world am I going to bring my dream game to life if I can't even get a basic player movement script to move this stupid capsule? It's funny. I finished putting together my last video that outlined how I'm going to start working on my dream game despite being a beginner at game development and Unity, and then once it was published, I realized what that meant. I actually have to start creating my dream game, which I know sounds stupid, but the thing is, it has been this hypothetical idea for so long that I'm kind of intimidated with where I should even begin. And I think this is fairly common. I mean, we hear all the time about how there's nothing scarier than a blank canvas, and essentially that is what an empty Unity project is, a blank canvas. So one morning I got up, got my coffee ready, sat down at my computer, and opened a new Unity 2D file. Then I quickly panicked and opened up my Obsidian notes to make a real game plan of where to begin, and that is where we are now. So hello again. Welcome back to Could I Code? My name's Chris, and I actually think I forgot to mention that in my last video, but either way, it's nice to have you here again with me. Today, I'm starting my dream game, and fortunately, in addition to this looming empty Unity project, I have my notes from the past few years about my dream game, Manaborn. Now, much like the last video, we won't be spending too much time with these notes, but there are two pages in particular that I want to dive a bit deeper into. The first note gives an overview of what I want Manaborn to be, while the second gives some direction for the initial prototype of the game. It is this prototype that will guide us through the next few episodes of this devlog as we start to turn this hypothetical idea into something playable. And here we are inside of our Obsidian vault for Manaborn. Now, we are going off script a bit here and just kind of exploring organically, but I'm going to try and keep this as quick and to the point as possible. The first note or page that I want to look at, again, is this Manaborn overview page that kind of gives us a look at what the game is trying to be. Now, the hook is hitting the old school nostalgia vibes while actually being a new game. A casual grinding game with the occasional epic hardcore boss fight. Story-wise, you are a part of a group of unique people, but you aren't a champion or a god or something. There is a main narrative, but it isn't forced on you as the player. Mysterious and magical lands can be explored. And this really comes back to a lot of the games that I loved playing as a kid. When I look at MapleStory, old school RuneScape, and even classic WoW, you were just an adventurer. Yes, you're more powerful than a lot of NPCs, but you're not the chosen one or something like that, which a lot of games have kind of pushed more to over time. Again, we're not making an MMORPG, but we're trying to capture the idea that you're still kind of one among many of the solutions to this world. Mechanical, action combat that forces a lot of fighting, minimal number of abilities, also introduces platforming jump quests, very account focused while allowing to go hard on a main. Visual, cute and simple creatures like MapleStory, vibrant and detailed world like Hollow Knight is kind of what we're trying to make a combination of here. And then lastly, we have the gameplay loop. So the big thing here is get access to new class, learn new class, level new class, and then unlock more new classes. So classes or jobs or whatever I'm going to call them are the core thing here. Obviously, as you have just a few skills, having access to a variety of different kits is going to be a lot of fun. And I think the main gameplay loop is going to be, getting one class or job to a specific level point and then unlocking either an advancement for that class or unlocking a new class that's like maybe a hybrid of classes or something like that. Now, we're at the development of Manaborn game. Obviously, we haven't completed building the Manaborn world, but this Obsidian Vault is kind of a step on the way there. We have Pick the Game Engine. I'm kind of starting in Unity, but I definitely think there'll be a few episodes where we experiment with some other engines, specifically maybe comparing certain mechanics and stuff before we absolutely move past the prototype and get into the full game development. And then the big one here is building that prototype. So one map, some enemies, some skills, bad art, really try to get the right feel of the game. And that's what the first few episodes of this devlog are going to focus on. Now, if I go into the prototype here, you'll see right away we do have some inspiration for what I think I'm trying to do for this first map. For those of you who haven't played old school MapleStory, this is one of the most popular training maps in it. It's just outside of the town of Hennesis. And essentially here, you're a character that can move around, climb, jump, do stuff, and, fight these creatures that are kind of simplistic in nature, but give you experience and allow you to grow. And that's the main loop that we're trying to implement in this prototype. So if I scroll down here, you can see my first kind of rendering in my notebook, so kind of just a sketch of the MapleStory map, and then my second implementation here, which is taking more of that inspiration from Hollow Knight, where you have kind of some similar features here. You have the platforms, a lot of the objects, but you have more foreground elements, background elements, and kind of like the actual structures that you can stand on. And I'm hoping to kind of match the second implementation where we've got some more detailed surroundings and stuff, but still have the kind of cute, cozy vibes as well. So it's gonna be a balancing act for sure. And then we do have a list of possible features. Essentially, I think the real things we're going to try to accomplish in the prototype is having a character that can do all the things we want. Maybe not everything like in class abilities and stuff, but can run, walk, jump, climb, and all that. Have a background that's representative of what I kind of want the implementation of the background to look like, even though that the final assets won't be prepared. Add some creatures, make it so that they can damage us and we can damage them. And maybe as a stretch goal, we'll look at having some equipment system or some class abilities come into the prototype as well. But I think that's kind of where I want to wrap the absolute prototype, is just having this map, a player, being able to interact with the map and the monsters and gain some experience. And that's kind of the big goals of this. It's a proof of concept, but that's where I want to start. So now that we have a bit of an idea about gameplay, it is time to bring our prototype to life, and the first element of this that I want to accomplish in this episode is adding our player and making them move. With this in mind, we jump back into our dreaded empty Unity project and start our Unity journey the same way that many others that have come before us have, with the Brachy's video. Specifically, I'm being a forward thinker and setting up version control for my project, which was something I experimented with slightly in my previous attempts to learn Gamedev. I watched both a Brachy's video and then a more up-to-date video from Sasquatch Beast Studios to confirm nothing major has changed in the years since the Brachy's video was published. Also, I'll mention this now in case I forget. I will try and call out all of the resources and videos I use in this episode, but I will also include a list in the description in case I forget to mention anything. With both videos watched, we went through the process of setting up a new repository for Manaborn and linking it to our Unity project. However, shortly after completing this, I discovered that the version of Unity I was using was several years old, so I updated to Unity 6 and set everything up again. Might as well start as up-to-date as possible. With version control in place, it was time to truly start the project. I started by watching a video from Bendux. I'm going to pronounce some of these wrong, and I do apologize to those channels, but Bendux, about 2D player movement, and worked on applying it to my game. Now, I've mentioned this a few times already through this video, but I am very much a beginner at Gamedev. I've done some small tutorials in the past, but it has been at least a year since I've opened Unity, and I feel like the first few episodes of this devlog will definitely be fairly reliant on tutorial videos. That said, my typical learning process with Gamedev is to watch a tutorial video and implement the lesson fairly guidedly for the first time around, but then try to be mostly self-sufficient in my next implementation of the same mechanic. As a beginner, I believe a large amount of self-directed learning is knowing how to look for the right answers online for your project, trying to understand the answers you find, and of course, a tremendous amount of debugging as you fit the solution into your project. So I followed the tutorial and implemented a scene with the ground, my beautiful capsule character, and the player movement script that I coded. The script even had a handy ground check logic that could allow our capsule to jump in addition to moving back and forward. I finished setting everything up and hit play, and it didn't work, or at least my capsule wouldn't budge an inch. I couldn't move side to side, and I definitely couldn't jump. I sighed to myself, went back to the video, and double-checked that I followed the steps correctly. Still nothing. I went and found another video from Adam C. Eunice about 2D player movement and still couldn't figure out why my player wasn't moving. It was at this point that I was starting to freak out a little, like, this is literally the first thing I'm trying to implement and I'm getting hard stuck. How in the world am I going to bring my dream game to life if I can't even get a basic player movement script to move this stupid capsule? Needless to say, I was getting very disheartened, but that's when I did the smartest thing I could. I took a step away. I drank some water, and I came back to the problem once I'd calmed down. I went back to the video from Adam C. Eunice about 2D player movement and saw that their first step had the capsule just moving by itself. I decided to try implementing this to see if there was something locking my capsule in place, and no, it moved, just really slowly. And that's when it hit me. I remembered making variables for movement speed and jumping power, but I could not recall what I set them to in the script. And the secret is, I didn't set them so the script was working, but just moving the player with 0 movement speed and 0 jumping power. After setting those variables, we had success. We finally had a moving player. Now that things were finally moving along, get it? It was time to upgrade this stupid capsule that had taken so much of our time and to finally add our mana-born character. Which means it is probably now that I should tell you a little bit about the mana-born race. The first thing you should know is that I'm far away from finalizing the art of any of these assets, so please remember this is just a prototype and these are just prototype assets at this point. With that excuse in place though, here is the initial notebook sketch I had for the mana-born race. The most significant traits are the short stature, overly large heads, and that they have blue eyes that will hopefully eventually feel like they are full of mana. I'm not really sure what that last one means, but for now it means that they have big blue eyes. As with the map from my first video, I used Procreate to convert this notebook sketch into a digital rendering of the player, which, once complete, could be plopped right into our Unity game to replace our basic capsule, voila. However, the sprite was facing the wrong direction and sinking through the floor. So I adjusted the box collider and then flipped the sprite renderer on the x-axis to fix the way the sprite was facing. A band-aid fix that would eventually come back to haunt me. Now that we had the absolute simplest version of a player in our game that could move, it was time to tackle my stretch goal for this episode of adding basic animations. As with previous steps, I turned back to YouTube and explored some tutorials for adding 2D animations to Unity and watched many videos from creators such as Gamedev Rocket, Dev, Gamecode Library, Brackies, and BMO. Ultimately, it looked like there were 2 different approaches to 2D animation for Unity: sprite sheets and in-game bone rigging. I debated between these 2 approaches for a little, but from the content I saw, I believe that in-game bone rigging would work best with my animation experience level and the future goal of adding different equipment to our character. So I set off on this path, specifically focusing on tutorials from Gamedev Rocket, Dev, and Brackies that focused on the animation system of bone rigging. I ensured that my player's limbs were separated into different layers in my PSD file using Krita, and that I had the necessary Unity packages installed to import my assets and animate them. One issue I initially faced was that Unity's PSD importer expected PSB files, and the file I had been working with was a PSD file and Krita was not able to save as PSB. I saw a lot of comments and forum posts about this problem and eventually found an easy solution of using PhotoP to convert my PSD to a PSB, after which I could easily import my assets into Unity. Once imported, I set to work rigging bones and adding inverse kinematics to my character. Similar to previous learning experiences, this was very much led by tutorials to begin, and then as I repeated the process, I was less and less reliant on the tutorial. You might be wondering why this process needed to be repeated, and we will get to that in just a second. Once my asset was fully rigged, it was time to animate. Based on the movement I already added to my player, I wanted to create an idle animation, a walking animation, and a jumping animation. I decided to start with the idle animation as it seemed like it would be the least complicated. Before animating, I watched a couple of videos about animation, specifically a video from Nonsensical 2D about idle animations, and then a video from Video Game Animation Study about the animations in Hollow Knight. I also made reference to a variety of image references of different animation poses through Google searching. Eventually, I had my first complete animation, which I previewed in-game. It was kind of trippy because it wasn't initially applied to my capsule character, so I was kind of looking at myself, which was kind of weird. I went through the process of moving all of the scripts and physics from the initial capsule character to this new sprite, and we had our animation on our actual character. However, he was always in his idle animation, even when walking and jumping, so we needed to make some more animations. The next animation was walking, which, believe it or not, was a lot more complicated than the idle animation. A lot more movement needed to take place, and it needed to make more logical sense with actual walking, which it only kind of happened to do in the end. We also needed to create an animator controller to help our game know when to have the player be idle and when to have the player walk. I have a Brachy's video to thank for this, and it was relatively easy to implement, with the main distinction between the two animations being the player's current movement speed. I ran the game again, and we had a player that could be idle and walk, but we had a few issues to work through. Number 1, his feet were not touching the ground. Number 2, he was moving too fast to be walking. And number 3, perhaps the most difficult to initially notice, his animations were all flipped on the x-axis. This last problem becomes the most noticeable in this clip, where it looks like my player has learnt to perfectly do the moonwalk. My band-aid fix of simply flipping the sprite's x-axis to match its movement direction was finally catching up with me. Was there a way to fix this issue in the Unity engine? Probably, but I elected to correct the issue at the source and flip the actual PSB file that is used for the underlying asset. This took time, as it meant importing the asset again, rigging the asset again, creating the idle and walking animations again, and creating the animator controller again. However, I believe this repetition would only serve me moving forward. Did I remember all of the steps on my own? No, but I used the tutorial significantly less this time around. It also let me improve the rigging and animations the second time around, paying more attention to keep the player's feet on the ground during the walking animation. And in the end, we got a much nicer final product that had an idle animation and a walking animation that were oriented in the correct direction. I also adjusted the jump power and the walking speed to match the vibe of the game and the animations more seamlessly. The last issue we faced was that we kept doing our idle and walking animation when jumping, which, while not terrible, was not our full stretch goal, so it was time to learn to jump. So I initially made a jumping animation where I wanted the player to kind of flap his arms while in the air. I created this animation in the animation tab and set to connecting it to the animator controller. The animator controller setup was much more difficult for jumping, and I feel like this web of animations will only continue to get more complicated over time. I relied on the same Brachy's video to get things set up, but decided to take my own path when it came to detecting when our player was grounded. We already had a piece of logic for this, and I wanted to use the same piece of code we already had instead of adding events that Brachy's recommended. I tested out my implementation, expecting to be done, and it did not work. No jump animation was played. So I started debugging the situation. I went through all the steps, ensuring that I followed things correctly until I veered off on my own direction. I tried adding direct transitions as opposed to using the AnyState node. I added debug.log code snippets to ensure that the right parts of my code were calling the animator. Then I started to blame my own divergence from the Brachy's direction. I reviewed the logic I was using and examined the ground check. I suspected that the ground check was overriding the jump action, as the player would be grounded for a few instances after the jump took place, and that might be turning off the animation before it began. So I removed the turn off portion of the code, and that did it. I could now start a jump animation when jumping. I just couldn't stop it. And also the jump animation looked stupid, but we'll get to that in just a second. I tried a variety of different solutions to resolve our problem of stopping this jump animation when being on the ground. Eventually, the solution I landed on was an if statement that set the jump animation bool to true if grounded was not true, and the jump animation bool to false if grounded was true. I feel like this was likely overcomplicating the solution, but it was a working solution. So we had the code working. We could be idle, walking, and jump with the associated animations playing at the right time. We just needed a less ugly jump. I think a rule that I have come out of this episode with is that less is more when it comes to animations. Several videos told me this, but I truly saw it in action with some of my initial animations. I also think that I need to create at least one terribly bad animation before the second, more tolerable animation can be created and let me move on. So I recreated a very simple jump animation and implemented it into the code. And there we have it, my idle, walking, and jumping character. I know it is far from beautiful, but it did actually feel very special to see something that started as just a sketch in my notebook as this living character in my game. It is amazing how animations, even bad ones, have this ability to make these inanimate objects feel alive when applied properly. I had completed my full stretch goal and the objective of this initial devlog. So lastly, I ensured everything was saved and pushed my changes in GitHub, something I had been doing through this entire process, but I specifically wanted to call it out now that I was finished with this chapter. And now it is time to start planning the next steps for my game. I think it is finally time to say goodbye to this boring ground and background that we've been staring at throughout this entire episode. Thanks again for joining me on this journey. I hope that you enjoyed our first steps that we covered in this video. If you did, please consider tossing this video a like and subscribing to the channel to keep following along. Also, if you have any recommendations for things that I could improve in my current setup, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Bye.